We've been talking through solutioning. Now we actually need to put it into a document that's packageable, that's useful for the rest of the team to go through. Now, in some cases, if you're in a very agile setup, you might want to forego some of the documentation. But I would say most of this is pretty essential to at least document somewhere, because it gives you good clarity of what the task is at hand, what data needs to be checked and referenced, as well as the primary one is as you're talking to different people within the customer organization, whether you're directly the customer or working with the partners, this gives you something to discuss that's kind of leading into the software, something you kind of talk through, explain the approach, something that just gives you a view of what's going to happen before you get there. And some of the slides are actually not the solution itself, it's just explaining some things that typically are useful when you get into these types of projects. So what this is the solutions document is really for the customer to understand what's going to happen. The audience, it's really multiple audiences. The customer can understand what's going to happen in a visual way before that occurs. The delivery team can get real requirements of what needs to be done before they actually start. In particular, what data is involved, what are the tasks need to look like, what's the high-level view of the process, how does the data come together. But it's also useful from a commercials perspective as well, because typically you're going to put a lot of this information into an SOW. And in my opinion, SOWs are sometimes very difficult to read and understand. So if you have an understanding before you get to the actual SOW, if you have a good understanding of how this data comes together, or how the approach comes together, that makes the SOW just a formality at the end. You just kind of all agree to. Everything's agreed except for the number at the end, and that's something the sales team can solve and work through. So you'll see these green boxes floating through, which are really just the explanatory ones. So in your in the one that I posted, those green boxes have been removed. So here they're just really to explain what's happening. So one thing I like to do, usually kick off the use case, is just having a quick overview of what's being put together. Most of this information is already in what you would have captured in the questionnaire, the qualification questions you went through. Most of this content is already in there. Some of it you might want to think through, some of it you might need to get confirmation from. I put a couple of red things in here. As you're walking through, you might have initially thought you got all the information you need, and then there's other data points that maybe weren't as clear. Maybe the FTE count continued to change and you want to validate it. This gives you a way to help document that, because the customer's going to share this around, and if the numbers are wrong, then you have at least a source of where that information was approved. Yeah, so most of these are in the questionnaire. Sometimes you might want to add more or less to this, take things out, but these tend to be the ones that we tend to focus on. The next slide here focuses very deeply into the data. So in particularly with machine learning, we talk through how the data is very, very important. And this is one view on how you can describe what that data is. So for something like invoice fields, there might be a few different types of information. Here we have some, basically the header information about the invoice and the vendor. Then we have the buyer information, which is essentially the information about the company that, the customer here, about their internal company, probably different entities within their organization that might be generating these types of invoices and have to pay. And then the bottom one line item information you need to capture deeper into each of these invoices. So within each of these data points, it's very clear what the data is and where it comes from. Because you can see that the invoice number is as found directly on the invoice. The invoice date is on the invoice, but formatted into, in this case, a European style. And then you have something where, let's see, one that requires some lookup here. So maybe here, we'll do this one, the location. Here it's looking for the city that it needs to collect it, but it's actually looking for not the city itself in the data that they want. They want the city, they want the master data identifier of the city, not the city name itself. So you have to find the city name in the document, and then you have to convert it in the background to get the data that you're looking for. You also might find with this conversation, there might be some fields that are challenging, or some fields that are challenging in the sense that Maybe the customer is not able to define what exactly they mean and where they come from, which I think is what happened here with the accounts. We pulled that one out of scope because it's not in the document. It's not something you can generate easily from the document. It's kind of an additional process that things have to go through. So because the customer struggled to define that one, we agreed to pull that one out of scope for the POC and then come up with different ways to define it later on. So this is one of the examples we went through. I think I redacted any of the customer information, but this is one that we generated to work off of. These next couple of slides, these actually are just standard screenshots from the WorkFusion demo, but they're here to really explain a couple of points. Because a lot of times when people are, when we're working with customers, more people keep getting added into the conversation. And by the time you get to the end, you have some people that haven't seen much about the software, haven't really done much with automation, but they're the ones that are really going to have to understand how it works because they're the ones that you're going to be working with from a day-to-day basis. So they might hear automation and think people are going to get completely removed and we're never going to have another person ever again touch this data set, which maybe is the ideal situation in the end, but more likely, as many of you are aware, with RPA you have exceptions, with cognitive you have these low confidence situations, we have cases where SMEs might need to be involved. So the emphasis here is to describe and just reinforce that people are still probably going to play a role within the process itself. So within this chart, it has the message of something that's purely manual at the beginning. Over time, that manual effort reduces. The volume overall actually increases. You can see that not all of the people go away at the end. Maybe there's some need for them to monitor the automation. Maybe they're still generating those low confidence cases or doing the SME review. But there is a need for people to be involved. Tied to that is what is the work that they are going to need to do? So they don't have to do all of the work. You might have these manual tasks that need to be generated. This is just an example of kind of a basic one that we'd shown as part of the demo to look at and just kind of review and say, okay, this is there. We can look at it. That's the type of work that they do. But more importantly, how do those get generated and how do those get used? So with machine learning and you're predicting data, usually you have that full, partial, and no automation situation that we had talked about in the demo yesterday. So if it finds all the fields with high confidence, all the data points get identified, and you maybe don't even generate that manual task. But maybe if it finds some of the fields but didn't find all of them, you have a partial automation situation. You still need to generate the task. There's just less work for people to do. And then maybe where it didn't really know what to do, it was a poor quality scan, it was not even an invoice. This data got kicked out and none of it was automated, but people still go in and kind of create the whole task. These are the typical situations that you'll have with any machine learning task. I put some percentages down at the bottom here of how they come together. It doesn't exactly add up to 100% because it is pretty variable for each use case. But usually what you'll find is maybe 30%, 30 to 50% are going to be fully automated in full production once you've seen enough data. 20 to 40% are maybe in this partial situation, and then you don't have too much in the no automation, maybe it's 0, 10, 20, depending on the use cases. But these 3 slides here are just really to reinforce what's happening, but especially when you get to the end, just reinforcing where the customer is going to head and what are the states they're in is sometimes useful, especially as you're pulling the full team together. So the full automation cases are the situation where it finds all the data points with high confidence. So those would actually be the cases where a machine task doesn't even get generated because it's confident in all of the data. You would typically find all 3 of these in every machine learning task. Rarely would you say this document is going to be fully automated and will never have partial or no automation. Rarely would you ever say that. And I'd say almost, if you're doing machine learning, you'd probably never say that. With machine learning, you're probably going to have some combination of each of these 3. The lightest one is usually the no automation case, but it also depends on how much data it's seen. The key point here, though, is these 3 situations are probably going to occur for every machine learning task that you have. Everyone wants full automation all the time, and that's great, and that's the goal, and I agree with that being the goal, but in a practical experience, that's not going to be the reality, especially early on, because the system needs to learn from things. The the more fields you have, the more likely it is going to be that one of those fields isn't found. These types of things all kind of play into how full automation is difficult, and it's definitely the goal and something you're striving for, but you're probably going to get a lot of cases that are partial automation. You're probably going to get a lot of no automation cases as well. But over time, as it's continuing to learn, you're going to get more and more in the full automation bucket and less in the other two. So the next 3 slides here talk about the process and how things are going to be applied. So this is kind of the format I've used, but there's different ways to do this. Actually, I have a couple different ways I do this too. So what I'm reinforcing on this slide here is you have this manual job on the left, and you want to convert it into an automated process. On the left-hand side, if you take a situation where maybe you have an invoices set up where you have a maker and a checker, this is kind of describing what's the work that they do. And they actually it's 5 steps that each person has to perform. The maker's doing all of them, the checker's only doing this in a subset, but that's kind of the current state today. As you convert it into an automated process, what are the different technologies and approaches that you're going to use? Often a focus on DPM, RPA, OCR, machine learning, or cognitive automation. Separating those out of where they apply and how they address each of these. And then identifying where people are going to be involved. So maybe you have a SME so maybe your checker is going to check all of them. So maybe they're not under machine learning, maybe they're their own step. In this case, it's saying you have manual tasks that support machine learning, from collecting the low confidence cases to doing the checker review within the machine learning. So this is just kind of a take of listing out the individual steps of what it is today, and then explaining where automation is going to address each one of those. And it's one way to do it, and maybe not the only way to do it, or definitely not the only way to do it. Done it a few different ways. But it tends to be a good idea to show the process today and give a visual of how the work is done. In this case, I have kind of the 3 swim lanes here: the maker line, the checker line, and then the automation line. If it's an as-is process, typically there's not any automation involved. So here it's just focusing on what are the activities that are being performed. And then the next slide is how are those impacted and adjusted by applying automation. One thing to keep in mind is that if you, however many steps you have for people here, you probably want to try and make it appear that you have fewer manual steps here and you have more automated steps here than if you move through. Because sometimes as you're thinking through the different automation pieces, you apply OCR, you apply whatever. Sometimes it's common that you'll come up with different exception steps, and you'll have still have a lot of work in the manual part, and you don't have as much in the automated part. The theme here is to show where automation is going to apply, and sometimes you need to kind of think through the process and make sure you're presenting it correctly to show that automation is really positively impacting the process and not generating a lot of extra work, extra steps, that sort of thing. Here, the color coding that I've used is to try and differentiate where you have work that's outside of the WorkFusion environment, and then once you pull it into the WorkFusion environment, what gets automated and what's manual, and then who are the actual entities doing it. I've seen lots of different variations of flowcharts. Sometimes swim lanes aren't the best way to do it. Sometimes color coding is enough. Sometimes you put the technologies in here as well. So instead of doing 3 separate slides here, maybe you just have 2, and you're able to put the different technologies into these as well. No hard way to do this. This is just the ones that I tend to generate that I go through as I'm thinking through the process and explaining where automation is going to impact the process. So then what I try to do is get a little deeper into the data, describe the manual tasks, and show what they might look like. So this is just a view of a manual task. I took the one from before and then added the data points onto the right-hand side. So I didn't do too much here. Just tried to be a little clear of how this would come together, the separation of the two, defining header data separate from line item data, that sort of thing. So this slide is probably pretty useful for something to go through. Here, from a solution consulting perspective, we tend to not get too deep into project plans to deliver on the projects, but it's still a good idea to give as much of a view as early on of how long this is going to take and what activities are involved. So the idea here with a standard information extraction approach where you're focused on something like invoices, where you're really just focused on machine learning, these tend to be the milestones that work really, really well to be able to deliver that project cleanly. Just to explain them a little bit, it's broken down into a few different, I guess 4 different milestones. The first one is just doing some setup and getting the SMEs comfortable. Part of the reason why this is important is because it's new software to people that might already have a different way that they're doing it. They also might have different processes that they're following. A lot of times we find that SMEs are working differently because there's no updated hard rule book they have to follow. Sometimes the SMEs have a different way that they do their work. In some cases, that's fine. As long as they generate the right data, that's okay. In other cases, they need to align and adopt a common set of principles so that you have the right data, you have the right process, since you're now codifying that into software. A question from Gaurav on whether it's best to do Agile or Waterfall. We definitely recommend Agile, and I threw that slide up yesterday, the MVP approach of moving through this. We recommend Agile because you can pull the benefits forward. Although some cases, customers might be a little bit more comfortable with Waterfall, and that's what they expect to use. It really depends. In the 12-week reference deployment, I think we broke that down into sprints and kind of took the Agile take with it. But sometimes it is a little bit more Waterfall in how it moves forward. It really will depend on the customer situation and the project team that's delivering it. But Agile is the recommendation. This might look a little more waterfall-y, I guess, maybe from that view. But this is kind of more the standard approach, the process you need to move through. You could do it in kind of an Agile approach, but these tend to be the methods that you need to follow. Is getting the SMEs on board, then getting an initial data set so that you can understand, just get everyone on the same page of what data you're generating and how that comes together. And then the final 2 milestones are how you're pulling together and doing the training. One theme here is the SMEs still need to tag all of the data that you want to do. So if you're doing 1,000 documents, which I think is the recommendation here, 800 documents, maybe that's the number here. We'd still recommend that the SMEs tag all 800 documents. The reason why is because you want to be able to check that the model got the answers correct. So you're not tagging all of the documents to then have the system learn from all of them, but you do want to have the end results. So when the system generates some predictions, you can compare the system generated ones, the machine learned ones, to what the people would have produced. So that's why we're recommending that SMEs tag all of the data, because at the end, the final step, you're going to have a few hundred documents that you had predicted with machine learning, and someone's going to need to make sure that they're correct. And the best way to do that is just have the SMEs, as they're moving through this, generate and tag all of the data, and then you have at the end, you have some data that the machine hasn't seen, and you use that to test the quality of the output. So that's kind of the theme. I guess not reading through all of it right here. That's kind of the theme that happens here, is you're able to break that up into a couple phases, so you can see that the machines get better from milestone 2 to milestone 3, but you also have the understanding that SMEs are still tagging all of the data, but the reason why they're doing that is because you have an easy way to check that the predictions that the model goes through are correct. And if you have historic data, that can be adjusted in this as well, but you still would want probably some level of SME involvement to make sure that the historic data got tagged correctly, make sure that the data came through cleanly, that sort of thing. If you want to put a team in here, that's good. And prerequisites are important as well. So as you're moving through this, I mentioned the 800 documents that you're looking through. A lot of times if we don't specifically define you have to provide this, otherwise the project will not start, sometimes it's a little difficult to get started. So I've split this into 2 pieces for the prereqs. One is to just do a full assessment. So I mentioned how the data is really important to review. So just being very clear that customer needs to provide or at least show a handful of different examples of the data itself. and then explain what systems are involved and just kind of prepare for this. But for the actual implementation, for that to really kick off and understand what really needs to be done, all of those documents need to be provided, or at least accessible to the automation team that needs to go through them. And then for the RPA part of it, a recorded demo or at least screenshots of what exactly needs to happen on each screen, so just to be clear on what exact effort, what exactly is needed from a step-to-step basis. The goal with this is just to be very clear what's needed to be able to automate and how does that come together. So obviously next steps are always useful. And then, let me go back here real quick. Next steps are always useful. Usually when we're preparing this solutions document, it's prior to an SOW. So these are kind of more focused on confirming everything that's in the document, using these to generate the SOW, and then getting ready to schedule the kickoff. Just to finish this up, in the appendix, I did a similar approach for a classification or matching. A lot of times we'll say classification instead of matching and vice versa. This is a different way to approach it, different machine learning approach. Here, this is focused primarily on historic data as opposed to having the SME tag. You can do it with SME tagging, or you can do it with historic data. It just depends on what's available. But these are kind of similar steps to move through as well, where you have data that's tagged. Some of it you use for testing, some of it you use to train on, and then at the end you have that kind of same setup. So you'll have access to this, so you can read through it. You can use it as you see fit. And then if you're doing classification or matching, different prerequisites for that as well. And then going into the SOW, what are specific items that you tend to want to include in the SOW from our view, but obviously a lot of you have your own templates, own expertise there.